To the average person, modern fencing can look a bit weird and a bit chaotic. Most people's exposure to swords and sword fighting generally comes from films, TV or maybe video games, which tend to prioritise coolness over actually representing realistic fencing. So I think people often have a few misconceptions about what fencing actually is and how it looks, and probably expect to see a bit more clashing of blades and spinning and twirling than is actually reasonable. Now, having said that, fencing is a sport. It isn't about pretending the weapons are sharp and you're actually training for a duel to death. It's a unique sport that is both mentally and physically challenging and rewarding in its own right. So yes, it is fair to say that modern fencing is unrealistic for many reasons, mainly because it simply isn't trying to be realistic, whatever that might mean. It's kind of a bit silly. You may as well ask how well would a badminton player do in a boxing match. You'd probably get some similar answers.
Look at this, a chair goes flying. No one's breaking these two up.
Having said all that, it is worth noting that fencing is in fact the direct descendant of real historical fencing practices. The coach who coached your coach's coach was probably trained by one of the great masters of old. Now, I don't know much about historical fencing, but I think it is fair to say that the sportification of fencing isn't something that's inherently modern or new. In fact, I think it's reasonable to assume that humans have been play fighting with sticks for thousands of years, maybe, I don't know. Alfred Hutton's 1889 treatise on sabre fencing contains rules that are fairly similar to the current rulebook, and I'm sure that someone more knowledgeable could show similar rules from earlier sources. Additionally, fencing duels were still taking place until as late as the 1960s, so it's not that long ago that the "what if they were sharp" question was at least slightly relevant. So even if it is a bit of a pointless question, let's look at what strengths a modern fencer might have if they were somehow transported into a historical duel, a real fight, whatever that might be. First, I'm going to talk about physicality. This is something that is so obviously fundamental to any athletic endeavour, but I think people often can be a bit dismissive of it for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's easy to just chalk it up to genetics or inherent God-given athleticism, which might be a factor, but the truth is, if you want to be as fit as a professional fencer, you have to train like a professional fencer, which requires a lot of hard work and dedication. People can sometimes be a bit dismissive over the physicality or minimise it because it's just hard work in the gym, no skill involved whatsoever. We saw this a bit when the Koreans became a dominant force in sabre fencing, in part due to their athleticism. And you would often see or hear people say things like, "Oh, it's all speed, no skill or technique," which is nonsense, because if you want to actually use your athleticism efficiently, you need a ton of coordination, technique, etc. So yeah, it might be the most boring thing, but athleticism is probably still the most important. Physicality ties in pretty well with footwork. Modern fencers recognise that footwork is really important, and it is something that we do a lot of. If you want to launch an attack, you have to be able to close distance quickly and efficiently. If you want to avoid an attack, the safest way is to move backwards as fast as you can while staying balanced. Having good footwork allows you to play with a distance, which is possibly the fundamental aspect of any kind of fencing, and maybe even any striking-based martial art. I read online that fencers who have a background in sports fencing often do very well in historical fencing, and I would guess the main reason would be that HEMA fencers probably don't do as much footwork and distance games as they should. Something that is often picked up upon is the two-dimensional nature of modern fencing. Whilst I'm sure lateral movements do come into play to some extent if you're in a 3D space, I don't think it makes that much of a difference compared to a sport like boxing. In boxing, the distance is kept fairly close. This means that by stepping around the opponent, you can find new angles to exploit. In fencing, the distance is generally a lot bigger, since the weapons give the fencers more reach. This means that if you step to the side, the opponent only has to pivot a little bit to still be facing you. Maybe sidestepping a thrust can be an effective move. In fact, we kind of see this in modern foil sometimes. But if you are being attacked, the safest move is always to step backwards.
Oh my. How did he do that? Can he land that? My.
Another important aspect of fencing is hand-foot dissociation. Basically, you want your hand and your feet to act independently, which is important for several reasons. Firstly, you want to be able to keep your hand relaxed and available whilst the rest of your body is working really hard to run away or move forwards. It's kind of like a duck, where above the water they might look smooth and controlled, but below the water the legs are kicking like mad. The other reason that hand-foot dissociation is important is that it allows you to hit with different timings relative to your feet. It's kind of like playing piano, where you don't want to have your left hand and right hand always stuck playing at the same rhythm. Sometimes you want to hit early in the lunge, sometimes later, and having the hands and feet act independently allows you to play with this timing. Now, the word timing is used a lot in fencing, and it can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes I feel like it's just blurted out a bit randomly because it's a word that covers so many different things. But basically, good fencers are good at feeling when to perform an action at a particular time, and this kind of coordination is integral to being able to do that. Next, I'm going to talk about hitting. So obviously modern foils, épées and sabres aren't actually real weapons. In fact, you can probably describe them as anti-weapons, given that they are designed with the intention of causing as little damage as possible. So as a result, sabres, foils and épées are lighter and more flexible than real swords that are dedicated to killing people.
This, sir, will kill.
Additionally, we are hitting to score points, not to inflict damage. So obviously the technique is going to be pretty different. Having said that, top fencers have an incredible level of control over their weapons that I think would transfer pretty well. When you see fencing blades in slow motion, they can look really soft and whippy, but I think you'd be surprised about how stiff they actually are when you hold them. These guys just have so much strength and control in their hands that they can make this steel look like rubber. I think one thing that HEMA fencers misunderstand is the importance of edge alignment in sports fencing. With electric scoring, it doesn't matter if you hit with the flat or the cutting edge. So you do get a lot of these hits with the flat that aren't exactly historically accurate. However, modern fencers do in fact train to use the cutting edge and have a lot of awareness over how they are cutting, and will do a lot of their training with their coach to get this feeling for the cutting edge. This is simply because using the cutting edge gives you lots of biomechanical advantages since your thumb is sitting directly behind the blade. This is especially true when parrying. One of the primary features of foil and sabre is the concept of right of way. This rule basically means that if you are being attacked, the first thing you have to do is defend yourself by making the opponent's attack fail, which makes a lot of sense from a historical perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, these rules aren't a modern invention. But there are a few problems with these rules. How do you define an attack? Is charging forwards without directly threatening the target an attack? And what does threatening the target even really mean? In the context of a sport where we are just trying to make a balanced and interesting game, We can kind of choose answers to these questions however we like, but this has resulted in a game that is further removed from its roots. However, I still think that right of way can teach some useful things. First of all, it teaches you to value taking the initiative and to commit to attacks. It also means when you are on defense, you really have to prioritize making the attack fail instead of just spitefully standing there and hitting the other person. It's kind of like training against a suicidal maniac who doesn't care about being impaled so long as he can finish his kamikaze attack.
Can he finish? Yes, he can.
This kind of leads me to my final point, which may be the most important. Fencing of any kind is incredibly psychological. You can be the fittest, most technical fencer in the world, but if you don't make the right decisions, you can, well, be taken apart by a fat old lady who just knows how to parry. As fencers, we kind of chase this flow state where we can read everything, see everything, respond to everything, but getting into this mental state is really hard, and it's really just psychological. It gets even harder when you add competition pressure, and doubly so when your entire life and career is dictated by your competition results, as is the case in high-level fencing. Obviously, it's impossible to recreate the stress of having your actual life on the line in a real fight, but I think finding yourself at 14-14 in a highly consequential match, it might feel surprisingly similar. If you want an example of mental toughness, then look at Anna Bashta in this match, where she was fighting for Olympic qualification, which is really important in the career of any professional fencer. Early in the match she tore her ACL, but despite the immense pain she kept fencing and continued to score points, only quitting when she was physically dragged off the piste. Maybe this isn't fencing for your life, but it might be the next closest thing. Anyway, how realistic fencing actually is doesn't really matter. It's a really amazing sport, it's really creative, subtle, complex and challenging. Maybe it's just a sport, but for me and so many people, it's a lot more than that.